Hello, we are the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health, or ACAM for short.
Wonderful. Okay, and hopefully that also means you can hear me, which is a good start. So, hello everyone. There's going to be 4 of us who are going to be presenting over the next few minutes, and then we'd really like to open up and have some discussion and hopefully some questions about what we're going to be talking about. And I suppose the first thing, just that I observed putting these slides together was just how much this field of research has come on. Even just over the last few years since I qualified, the kind of discussion around voice hearing during childhood was not something that was kind of particularly widely spoken about when I first became a clinical psychologist, and now we very much recognise it as a fairly common aspect of childhood. And we're going to be hearing from Zara and Lauren and Hannah about some of the different ways that we can think about voice hearing over the next few minutes. But I thought I'd just take you through some of our work, and just a quick shout out to some of our colleagues who aren't with us this evening. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in research and practice with young people who hear voices and have other sometimes distressing, sometimes just sensory experiences. We've got Zara Eve who's with us, who's going to be talking about her research around emerging multiplicity during adolescence and young adulthood. We've got Lauren, who's going to be talking about her PhD looking at imaginary friends, and we're going to hear from Hannah, who's a trainee clinical psychologist who is exploring the flow of compassion for young people who hear voices. And this body of work has really come around from research that was started back in 2016 with Voice Collective, who are based within Mind in Camden, and they support young people who hear voices, see visions, feel the presence of more than oneself in the body, and they provide a range of support for young people and parents as well. They provide training to practitioners, and it's been a joy really collaborating with them over the last few years. And I'll talk a bit more about the projects that we're working on now. So I suppose in terms of where we're up to and what do we know now, we know that there's a huge variety of experience in terms of this continuum really of sensory experiences that can present differently for different people. And I've noticed as well, particularly in terms of publications, when I first started working in this field, I'd quite often come across the sentence auditory hallucinations, sometimes also known as hearing voices, whereas these days it's much more common to just see a kind of a reference to voice hearing, hearing or seeing things that others don't. But we would certainly recognise that those experiences are real and true for the people who are experiencing them. So I suppose it's understanding the nature of those experiences for that individual person. We know that young people want better access and earlier access to tailored compassionate support. We know that desire for support needs to be varied and offered across contexts, not only in mental health services. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And we know that parents and practitioners can actually feel really quite de-skilled and under-supported in terms of how to support children who are perhaps having very distressing voice hearing experiences. And a lot of the work that we've been doing has been looking at how we can provide support, how we can develop resources for parents as well. From the research that's been done so far in this area with the younger age groups, which is limited, it does seem as though it's the cognitive and therapeutic elements of approaches such as CBT. So one of the approaches that's been trialled for young people who are having distressing sensory experiences and wanting to access mental health support is to try and adapt some of the protocols for CBT for psychosis that have been trialled with adult populations. And young people seem to be saying it's those cognitive elements that are most helpful, having a safe and supported space to talk that's most helpful. So elements like normalisation, psychoeducation, space to talk to someone without judgment, where there's perhaps not an assumption that just because somebody hears voices they might have psychosis. So it's that those sorts of spaces, those sorts of therapeutic approaches that seem to be particularly helpful. Through a lot of the qualitative work that we've been doing, we've also heard how we really need to kind of, I suppose, move away from this idea of assuming that all voices are scary, frightening, unwanted. We've heard through a lot of our qualitative research from young people who actually find some of the voices very comforting, very supportive. In one of our studies, we also identified this kind of reciprocal relationship. So when a young person hears a voice who is friendly and comforting and supportive, there's often a reciprocal element to that relationship where the voice isn't just something they hear from, it's something they also can talk to. So really, really broad array of experiences along this continuum. We were lucky enough a couple of years ago to get some funding from Emerging Minds to set up a network through which we really wanted to prioritise the voices of young people with lived experience, hear from them what they think the research priorities are and what that means for developing and shaping services and access to support. And through these consultations, we developed a number of kind of conversation points, really, including this infographic that we developed in one of the discussions. And we heard how young people could have some really quite surprising experiences in mental health services. So, for example, we heard from some young people that they actually felt quite a burden not to shock or frighten a practitioner, and that sometimes they were having to sort of do quite a lot of emotional work in that therapeutic space to almost sort of look after the practitioner and sort of phase information in quite carefully, kind of judge and second guess how much they could share, particularly about some of perhaps the more taboo experiences. So some really quite surprising information came up as well. But persistently, it was these messages around, not having to tell really traumatic stories again and again, having space and time to talk through very difficult, very complex experiences that perhaps been silenced, that perhaps they didn't have language for. To be believed in terms of the experience, and that it was real and very true for them. And I suppose just highlighting some of perhaps what we do know from across mental health services, that it can be extremely daunting to turn up at a clinic, to have to talk about deeply personal experiences with someone that you don't know and perhaps have never met before. So it was really, really helpful to hear from young people about what good support would look like, and it's this work that's really directly taken us to the next steps and further research as well. And throughout our research, one of the things that we've been trying to do is ask young people what they found helpful, what they would recommend for other young people with some of these experiences. And again, this message of kind of listening without judgment, trying to listen without assumptions is really, really important. Having space to just explore the experience, drawing things out, writing about things, just having different mediums to make sense of something that isn't spoken about very much in schools or at home. We heard particularly from the group of young people who really value their voices and see them much more perhaps as friends, that it's not helpful to assume that people don't want the voices anymore, and if interventions are consistently designed to remove or block voices, and that can in itself feel quite threatening. We heard as well particularly from younger children that they perhaps weren't worried when they first started hearing voices. Some of the younger participants hadn't thought that everyone didn't have those experiences. It wasn't until they saw very anxious or very frightened parent or teacher when they said, oh, I hear voices sometimes, or whatever, it might have been that they, however they sort of phrased it. It was kind of when they saw the anxiety in someone else, that made them feel very anxious. And in some cases, they actually noticed a kind of emotional mirroring, where the voice then also became quite anxious or could become quite angry. So actually being able to regulate how we're feeling and to regulate our communication when talking with young people about these experiences is really, really important. And we heard that it was sometimes quite challenging to find reliable information, especially on Google. So having and finding reliable sources of information was really, really important. I've mentioned Voice Collective already. There's also the Hearing Voices network. I've put a link in the chat to our research page. So anything that we develop with people with lived experience, or any outputs we develop from the research, we upload on there. So please do have a look. One of the things that we did a couple of years ago with Voice Collective was to take some of the qualitative data that we had from young people and work with an animation company to put together some very short information films about how to support young people at home and at school and in mental health settings as well. So those might be helpful. And there's a nice guide in there written by young people who were volunteering at Voice Collective, and with some of our qualitative data about what young people would recommend for other young people who have voices and visions. So this is a quick snapshot on the right hand side here of that document. So that's on the link as well if you'd like to have a look at that or pass that on to people. But you'll notice from some of these quotes how multisensory some of the coping strategies that have been identified by young people are. There's perhaps very few points in our lives where we're quite as self-conscious as we are during adolescence. So actually, talking about hearing voices and seeing visions, especially those more perhaps taboo areas, in a clinic can be really tough. So having other ways to communicate some of those experiences can just be really helpful. Being able, as I say, to kind of draw things out, write about things, journaling. It can also just be really helpful to make sense of quite an unusual experience, especially if it's only recently started. One of the things that I really like about the way Voice Collective do their training as well is highlighting that it's different things suit different people. For some people, if they're having really distressing, really intrusive voices, it might be that to block them out through the use of medication for a time can be really helpful. Just have a bit of a break, a bit of breathing space, to kind of recenter and look at some of the coping strategies. Other people find distraction, really loud music, helpful. Other people like to kind of illustrate what it is they're experiencing so that other people can see it from their perspective. So really different range of experiences. We also heard about how people can use visualization to cope with some of the voices and visions, in a similar way to how approaches like compassionate mind training kind of actively evoke imagery, and we can work through exercises to create images in the mind. That's kind of all quite akin to what some of the young people were talking about. So really creative coping strategies that often a lot of young people had found and developed on their own. So it's through the vein really of setting these research priorities and hearing about what young people want. We've been looking to develop an app for young people who hear voices with the amazing Hearing the Voice team at Durham. Victoria Patton's really led this piece of work, and an app's nearly being developed. We're hoping to be able to take that forward quite soon. It's been a really fantastic project to be involved with, and yeah, really looking forward to seeing that out and available for people. A few of us across England have also been looking at how we can take some of these recommendations from young people and develop them into brief interventions that can be delivered in CAMS. The Sussex Voices Clinic are leading a bit at the moment around looking at how brief interventions can be delivered through schools for young people and parents and teachers, so really tapping into that important normalisation and psychoeducation element as well. So yeah, really excited to see how that goes. And a team of us in Lancaster are just we're waiting on the final verdict as to whether or not we can go ahead with a project that would particularly look at how very distressing voices and visions can increase the risk of self-injury and suicidal thinking. So we've kind of identified that this seems to be a particular risk factor for a small group of young people, and we'd really like to investigate and explore those kind of intersections in more detail to see what, where would be the useful point of support, what would that support look like. So hopefully we'll be able to take that forward. So lots of exciting work going on, and it's lovely as a practitioner and researcher to see how the research so far is driving forward change and support for young people and families. So I'm going to hand over now to Zara, who's going to talk us through her PhD and the, again, exciting information that she's getting from this and how it's translating into options for supporting young people. So Zara, are you there?
I am.
Great.
So like Sarah says, I'm just going to briefly talk about my research, which focuses on emerging multiplicity. So it's important to kind of just give you a little bit of background into the area, just in case you haven't heard of it before. So it's commonly understood that people have different thoughts, feelings, behaviours and emotions based on different contextual factors, such as who you're with or the role that you have at that moment in time. So you'll kind of act differently if you're with friends or if you're at work, but these different kind of facets generally amalgamate into one unified personality. But for people that experience multiplicity, it's thought that those different facets are distinct separate people rather than different personality parts. So simply put, multiplicity is the experience of having more than oneself in the same body. And there is a limited literature base available, and within that there's an argument that multiplicity can be positioned on a spectrum alongside healthy dissociation, which includes daydreaming, and dissociative identity disorder, which is a mental health disorder which is commonly associated with high levels of distress, impairment and memory gaps. And while both dissociative identity disorder and multiplicity involve having two or more people within the same body, dissociative identity disorder is considered a clinical disorder, while multiplicity is more a holistic experience, which is often supportive, positive and protective for many people. But that non-clinical aspect hasn't really been focused on, both within literature and within service provision currently. So I completed a review of the literature and found that 11 papers discussed experience that related to the spectrum of experiences, but only one specifically named multiplicity, which kind of lends itself to the idea that there is a big focus on the medical side of things, which can be useful for many people. And it's really important that people who do fall into that category do get the support and the resources that they need. But it also ignores a wide range of people that maybe don't feel aligned to clinical descriptors or feel that their experiences are positive and they don't require that level of intervention. And it's really important that people can explain what they're going through clearly, and they feel like when they speak to people that they can understand also what they're going through. Can I have the next slide, please, Sarah? So that leads us on to kind of some practical tips, both for living with multiplicity and for supporting somebody who lives with multiplicity. And that might be a friend, a family member, or it might be within clinical services. So if somebody comes to you and says that they feel like they're having the presence of having more than one person, really understanding what that experience is and how you can help those people. So it's important to ask about people's personal language preference. So I referred to the experience as multiplicity, but other people might prefer to call it plurality or dissociation or numerous other terms. So there isn't that standardized language that's currently available, which sometimes makes it a bit difficult for people to share their experiences because they're a bit worried that people might not know what they're talking about. And people that experience multiplicity also call themselves a range of different names. So they might call themselves alters or headmates, systems or parts, and it's completely up to them. It's completely up to kind of what they feel most expresses what they're going through. But it's really important to use that language that they're comfortable with when you're talking to them and that fits with their experiences. So I've spoken to people with lived experience, support networks and professionals, and the people that I've spoken to have really stressed the burden and the stress that gets put on them when they're asked to prove their experiences. And it often feels like people don't believe them, and it creates a fear and a distrust within that relationship. So if somebody does come to you and says that this is what they feel that they're experiencing, it's not up to us as external people to say, I don't believe you, or you need to show me what's happening. You just kind of need to take them at their word. They've felt that you're there for them and that you're their supportive network. And it's important to kind of go into that conversation with an open mind and an open support. If you are somebody that maybe experiences multiplicity, or you wanted to find out more information and find that community, people often find it useful to share their experiences with open-minded people, and this often comes online. So there's a really big community on Twitter that's really supportive, and people feel like they can openly share their experiences within that anonymous forum, especially when they're maybe coming to grips with their experiences at the start, which has been quite useful. People with multiplicity have found it useful to develop their internal communication, but this can be developed in a range of ways. So for some people, it is speaking to people internally. Sometimes it might need that intervention from services to kind of bring those conversations about. But it's important to remember that it's different for everybody, and that for some people it might take a while. But some people that I've spoken to said that as soon as they were aware of their experiences, they had positive communication, and it just didn't need to kind of develop, it just happened. But one way in which communication has been useful for people is to use schedules. So everybody can have their time at the front if they want to kind of control the body, that they can do activities that they enjoy, and they can talk to external people, because sometimes people might feel that they're ignored or they're only seen as part of a whole self, rather than being distinct people who might enjoy different behaviours or different conversations with different people. But it is important to consider that isn't the same for everybody. So some people may not want to control the body, they may not want to have those conversations externally, or it may be that they feel that they'd rather just sit back within the system internally. So it's important to accept people's headmates on their own term and not dictate what should happen to them. Finally, kind of one other way that people have spoken to me that they've said has been useful is to keep diaries or make lists of events that happens. So that's been useful for people that have amnesia. So sometimes if they're not in control of the body, they may not be aware of what's going on. And it's also useful to use diaries just to develop that communication. So you know what's happened. If you're going to switch to somebody else that's going to be in control of the body or front, then it's useful sometimes to do a little bit of a handover, just tell them what's been going on, maybe if they've done certain jobs or different chores and things like that that they wouldn't be aware of otherwise. But just developing that communication and that relationship internally has really helped people find their experiences not maybe as distressing or harmful, and it's really a protective and supportive factor for many people. Within my PhD, I'm still talking to professionals who work with young adults experiencing multiplicity. So if anybody would like to get involved, my email is on the slides and it's been popped in the chat. And you can also email me if you wanted to join the mailing list, so whenever I publish any research in the area as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Zara. And I'm going to hand over now to Hannah.
Thanks, Sarah. So my study, which I'm in the early stages of, is going to focus on the idea of compassion in young people's relationships with their voices. So we can think of compassion as being an attitude of kindness and non-judgment. Compassion also involves recognizing that everyone struggles at times, everyone feels pain. And so if you're struggling with something in your own life, you're a completely normal human being. And compassion also involves paying attention to some of those difficult feelings when they crop up, rather than, trying to block them out. So the way that I'm looking at it is that if a person who hears voices is compassionate towards themselves, that might mean having a sort of non-judgmental attitude towards the fact that they happen to be hearing voices, and knowing that that's kind of within the realm of what's normal and okay. If they're being compassionate towards the voice itself, that might involve really listening to what the voice has to say and understanding where the voice is coming from, understanding what the positive intentions the voice might have for them. And if a voice hearer experiences their voice as being compassionate to them, it might be that they notice the voice actually being supportive or friendly, or notice that the voice seems to want the best for them. Even if the voice sometimes doesn't go about it in the same way, there might be a positive intention there. So I recently did a review to find out how the notion of compassion crops up in the existing literature on voice hearing. Most of the papers I found were about adults. There were very few that focus on children and young people, which my study is going to specifically do to try and address that gap in the literature. So as Sarah was saying earlier, therapy for voice hearing so often over the years has focused on trying to help people who hear voices to basically get rid of their voices, trying to sort of push them aside almost, or block them out. It might encourage people to sort of stand up to their voices, maybe saying, no, I don't agree with you, what you're saying isn't true, I don't have to listen to you. And for some people, all of those strategies, they work, but for others, they can actually make it worse. As Sarah was saying, some people find their voices can be helpful, and it would be wrong to try and stop that helpful relationship. Sometimes when people find that their voices are kind of nasty to them, they can get nastier because they don't like being ignored, they don't like being disagreed with. And for some people, when that happens, it would make them feel potentially like they couldn't keep going to therapy because the voice was too angry with them, too unhappy with the therapy that was taking place. So there's kind of relatively little research that's been done, and relatively little clinical work, I guess, that's been done to particularly focus on increasing compassion with voices. But there have been some papers written that show that really listening to what the voices have to say and understanding what their positive intention might be, it really does help to build a sort of kinder and more supportive relationship between the hearer and the voice. Now, the trouble is that because there is relatively little research with children and young people, we don't know if the same things that work for adults would work with children and young people. There have been some studies that suggest that young people might not need to make sense of their voices in the same way that adult voice hearers do, as in they might not need to understand what's happened in their life to make the voice come about. But what they do really value is kind of normalization of the voice, kind of understanding that it's not wildly abnormal to hear voices and that lots of other young people do. There's actually been, there are lots of estimates of how many people hear voices. One review I found suggested that around 12.7% of children hear a voice at some point in their childhood, and around 12.4% of adolescents hear a voice, which is a lot more than the percentage of adults that we estimate hear voices. So it's so important that we do hear from young people. They've got this, they've got insights to share with us that we're not hearing. Also, because children and young people who hear voices, they may not be in contact with mental health services because they might not have told anyone that they're hearing a voice. or their parents might not have wanted them to get in touch with mental health services. We don't know what young people might be doing kind of naturally, so strategies that they're naturally using that they've discovered for themselves that maybe no one else has told them about, but they've naturally found. So that would be another really crucial insight that we can get from children and young people. What else was I going to say? So in my own study, I'm going to be asking young people directly about their experiences. I'm going to recruit online through peer support networks and social media. And I'll be asking people to fill in online questionnaires. So that way they can stay anonymous, and they may or may not have ever used mental health services. That's really important so that we're not kind of biased towards a clinical sample, and we can hear like a whole cross-section of different experiences that people have had. So to take part, people will need to be aged between 13 and 24 and have heard at least one voice that other people didn't hear. I am not recruiting just yet. I'm hoping to start recruiting later this year. So my email address is down there on the slide, and we'll copy it into the chat as well. So I would love to hear from you if you are interested in the study, if you'd like to join a mailing list, or if you're a young person, or if you know of young people who might want to take part in the study.
Great, thanks very much, Hannah. We're going to move on to Lauren before we break for questions.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Yeah, brilliant. Great. Sorry, I was just about to say my slides on here. Okay, so just before I start to talk about my study, I just want to kind of recap those really important points of not pathologizing hearing voices. You know, just like Sarah said earlier, it's quite a common human occurrence, and they've estimated about 75% of people will hear a voice at least once in their lifetime. So you know, it's a fairly common occurrence. And then obviously, contrary to what you may believe, it doesn't always indicate that there is a mental health problem there. You know, some of the reasons why you can hear a voice could be that you've had a lack of sleep, you've got extreme hunger, you know, maybe you're overworked, you're stressed, or you're over worried. And then, sorry, I'm getting quite a few people saying they can't really hear me. I'll try and talk a little bit louder. Is that any better? And then sometimes if you're a bit under the weather and you've got a high temperature, or even with recreational drug use as well. So please just remember, it's not always a negative experience. You know, some people, again, like Sarah said earlier, it can be quite a positive, comforting feeling for some. You know, not always annoying, intrusive voices. If you do want to have a look at the USEN website, there is a link just on this page here. Can I have the next slide, please, Sarah? Thank you. So moving on to my research, it's a little bit different, not really focused on hearing voices as such, but more about imaginary companions in children. So although imaginary companions in adulthood could be described as a voice maybe inside or around the head, children usually engage with invisible friends. They could be, you know, another child, an animal, could be something completely made up like an alien. It could be a personified object, so it's more than just kind of playing with an object. It's given this object like a personality, a life of its own, or it can be an impersonation the child has created as well. So the existing research around imaginary companions with children kind of focuses on those psychosocial benefits. And we know that it enhances language skills, it gives the children a greater theory of mind, and second order false belief. It can enhance emotional skills, social skills, and quite a lot of benefits in those aspects. But nobody's actually looked at what we could do with this occurrence, what kind of psychotherapeutic benefits there might be. And because it's so understudied, when we look at the literature, it's hard to find any research on those possible therapeutic benefits. So to do my research, I first want to talk to adults who have worked with children or who have children of their own, who engage with imaginary companions. And the questions will be like semi-structured, but will come from the systematic literature review, and it will be informed from that review. And then the second phase will be much more tailored towards two groups of children. So we'll again do something called an ethnographic study. So it's working with children in their own setting. So it could be in their own home. Make the children as comfortable as possible. That might mean that we do repeated visits to build up a rapport with children. We don't expect a child of 5 years old to just come and sit at a table and answer a questionnaire. That would be quite cruel. But the first group will be between the ages of about 5 and 8, and then the second group between about 9 and 12. And it can be doing tasks that they enjoy, that the child is comfortable with. We can really tailor those interviews around the child's interests before we ask and go through that ethnographic process. We haven't started the process of gathering data yet, but that will be starting soon, hopefully. So if you would like to be added to the mailing list for this research, my email is on the next slide. Thank you.
A few of the Q&As that have come up. Matt, do you want to start us off with the polls?
Yeah, I'm just running a poll here, which I probably should have done at the beginning of the session. I do apologise. But whilst that's going on, Sarah, if you wanted to go ahead with the questions, that would be fine.
Sure. There was a really interesting question that came up actually around bringing voices into I think therapeutic conversations, and I've given a typical clinical psychologist answer of sometimes yes, sometimes no, sometimes sometimes maybe, because I guess it really depends on what the therapeutic benefit would be, the relationship of the voice to the young person, sometimes even the degree of personification. So I've certainly worked with people where it has been helpful to talk about who else they can hear or what else they can hear whilst we're having a conversation as well. Sometimes just to notice that, sometimes try and explore meaning, why particularly they might hear that voice or that comment in the here and now. Other times actually it's helpful just to have a really protected space so that the young person can just really focus on themselves. So sometimes I've also done things like sensory grounding techniques kind of in the therapeutic space, just to kind of bring our attention back to the conversation that we're having and steering it a little bit more that way. So yeah, I just thought it was an interesting point. It comes up in research as well. It's something I've come across directly, and I know Zara as well, particularly when you're working with multiple systems. Sometimes it is really essential to gain, for example, informed consent from everybody within that system that might be present within a research interview. So there are points where you really do need to be working very systemically with, or even though it's sort of one physical person opposite you or working with you, it's good to kind of have that systemic perspective. I'm just having a look at the other questions that have come in. Just there's a question here asking whether there's much research for children who hear voices and voices causing seizures, and I suppose that's one of those interesting intersections. I noticed there was another question around hearing voices for young people with autism as well. I think because so much of this work is really in the early days, we're sort of just the point really of finding these apexes where we need to kind of bring areas of research together to look at how they may or may not link and influence one another. So I'm afraid that's not one I can answer right now, but I would say we're sort of, I know us and other groups working in this area starting to sort of try and connect some of these experiences up. There's another question here around medication for young people under 18 who hear voices, and I suppose I'd just say, there have been very recently actually some interesting trials looking at the benefits of medication, therapeutic and kind of talking therapies as well, combinations. But like anything, it's very individual and depends on a number of different factors. Matt, did you want to come in with the?
Yeah, sure. There's just a couple of other things. We are supposed to finish in a couple of minutes, but within your talk, you made reference to some resources. I wondered if the team could also just post those in the chat, and if you could just run through those, particularly for parents. We've got a couple of parents that are in the audience today, so I think that might be useful.
Absolutely. I'm just going to paste that in the chat to everybody now. So on here we've got some self-help guides that have been developed with young people with lived experience of voice hearing. We've also got the 3 short little videos that I mentioned, one of which is for parents based on the research that we did with parents and young people. So hopefully that'll be helpful. And there's also one for teachers and people working within schools. We've heard that teachers can be kind of one of the main groups of people that young people can confide in around these experiences. So we thought it'd be helpful to actually just put something together for people in schools as well around kind of how to start some of these conversations, and some of the language bits and pieces that might be useful.
Excellent. Thank you very much. If people could just fill in that poll, because we obviously do want to try and improve and develop everything that we do. If you didn't think it was any good, then do please let us know. You don't have to be all encouraging. I personally thought it's fantastic, but I would say that. So just one final question that has come through on the chat, which I found quite interesting, is that around the idea of perhaps the idea of an imaginary friend might be an extension of hearing voices. Is that something that comes up quite a lot?
Yeah, and again, that's one of those kind of intersections that we're just exploring now. So it'll be really interesting to see what comes from Lauren's research. And we've also got another colleague, Abby Connolly, who is a mental health nurse by trade, who's also doing a PhD in this area. And she's specifically looking at similarities and differences between voice hearing for younger children and imaginary companions, because from the work that we've done so far, there seems to actually be quite a lot of overlap. One of the biggest reasons why we seem to switch language from imaginary companions, imaginary friends to voice hearing just seems to be a child's age. So we're kind of trying to explore kind of phenomenologically in terms of features, in terms of relationships, what are those similarities, what are the differences, is it helpful to strictly delineate or not? So yeah, that's another thing. So yeah, keep an eye on that webpage and we'll put information out as soon as we've got it.
That's fantastic. So just to let everyone
find out more about becoming an ACAM member and to be part of the advancement of child and adolescent mental health, visit www.acamh.org.